This video contains full spoilers for the first 5 episodes of X-Men 97. The X-Men are a part of the superhero world I haven't really talked much about on this channel, mostly because there hasn't really been much if any X-Men related content in the last few years. Thankfully though, we now have gotten X-Men 97, a continuation of the 90s X-Men animated series. Although I'll be honest, when this was announced, I was interested, but maybe not excited. The 90s series was before my time. The X-Men show I grew up on was X-Men Evolution, but even then, I definitely would have preferred a new X-Men series. Still, I decided to watch the show. The trailers looked really great, and I'll pretty much watch anything that Marvel releases, having not seen more than an episode or two of the original, and by the time the second episode had ended, I was absolutely dug in, and also genuinely really impressed. What inspired me to make this video, however, was episode 5, conveniently exactly halfway through the season, which is an episode that absolutely blew me away. So what I'll be doing in this video is a bit of a mid-season review, going episode by episode with the first 5 episodes, reviewing them and rating them, all from the perspective of someone who is a fan of the X-Men, but maybe not a die-hard fan, at least with X-Men the animated series, as like I said, I only have seen like 1 or 2 episodes. I did watch a recap of the series though, so I know everything that happened. Make sure to subscribe, help me get to 100,000 subscribers, and let's begin, although not quite yet, going episode by episode. Before we get to the episode by episode review, I want to talk about some generalities that are true for every episode. For one, the intro is absolutely fantastic. It's a type of intro you never want to skip because, for one, the music absolutely slaps, and also the intro changes from episode to episode, another reason why you would never want to skip it. This intro does not have any nostalgic value for me, and yet hits so hard. I absolutely never skip it. I love the art style and animation of the series, which seems to use a blend of 2D and 3D animation to achieve a very nice balance between keeping the look and feel of the original series with a more modern and more fluid animation style. The visuals are absolutely fantastic as well. There's a heavy focus on like colors and lights, and while obviously the series isn't always 100% of the time perfect looking, there are times where I'm genuinely blown away by how good this show looks. Like, it's one of the best looking animated series on TV, and a big step up visually from Marvel Studios' other animated series. I wouldn't say I've been particularly blown away by any of the voice acting so far, although it's all been pretty much good, save for maybe Magneto and Storm, who I think have been the highlights of the season in terms of dialogue, but I think that's more so because they were the best written characters and have the most memorable lines. That out of the way, let's begin with the episode, starting off with episode 1, titled To Me, My X-Men, which is one of the most iconic X-Men lines, and yet a movie watcher would have never heard it, which does speak to something that, to me, it felt like the show deliberately set out to do from the get-go, everything the movies failed to do. The biggest example of this is Cyclops, who in direct opposition to the movies is an absolute badass here and outshines Wolverine at every opportunity, especially in episode 1, where he's a competent leader and has his powers used so creatively in the action scenes, like using the force from his blast to effortlessly move around the field or to slow down his fall from the sky. In just one episode, X-Men 97 showed how cool Cyclops can be, proving truly how wasted he was in the movies. This was first shown off in the opening scene where the X-Men saved the future Sunspot from the Friends of Humanity, which was a great reintroduction to these characters, showing off a few of their power sets off the bat and some of the villains as well. The episode does slow down from here, however, slowly but surely reintroducing the likes of Gambit, Rogue, Jean Grey, Jubilee, Beast, Morph, and Wolverine, all in slightly different ways that allows each introduction to be unexpected and very welcome. Keeping focus on Cyclops, this episode gives a lot of focus to Jean's pregnancy and her trying to convince Cyclops to leave the X-Men, which did make for some emotional moments that, looking back, were very clearly hinting that this is not the real Jean Grey. There is this scene right after Scott and Jean talk about leaving the X-Men where Wolverine snaps at Cyclops, and from there on out, his feelings for Jean, they're pretty much the only thing about him that's focused on, at least in the first 5 episodes, and while this is more of a general thing, it's not just for this episode, I will say that this is probably my biggest complaint with the series. Wolverine comes off as a bit of a loser who can't let Jean go despite her being married to Scott and pregnant with his baby. Madeline Pryor showing up builds that up as well, but man, I'll be honest, I really don't care about Wolverine's feelings for Jean Grey. I wish they focused on something else with him completely, because so far in the series, Wolverine has not really done too much interesting. But like I said, that's my one big complaint about this show. This episode from there becomes a bit more classic superhero, interrogating the bad guy and fighting robots, and it's pretty awesome. Everything from the tension between the X-Men and Gyrick, the X-Men dropping into the field, which is so cool, the fight that ensues, and especially Storm's entrance with the line Omega level mutant detected. This whole sequence definitely got me way more excited for the action of the series than I previously was, because it looks spectacular. The depth of the series, however, was solidified with episode 2, which was set up by the cliffhanger of episode 1, which admittedly would have been crazy had it not already been shown in the trailers, but every single episode after this did have a crazy cliffhanger that was not shown in the trailers. Episode 2 is titled The Mutant Liberation Begins, and already blew me away with just how much happens, not just in these 30 minutes themselves, but the whiplash of starting the series and not getting much of a breather before shit already hits the fan. And let me tell you, I absolutely love it. It's such a breath of fresh air, especially when you compare this to most Marvel Disney Plus shows where the series takes forever to get anywhere and then just ends too soon. This series wastes absolutely no time, telling like an entire MCU Disney Plus series worth of story in like an episode or two. This episode is all about Magneto, arguably the most compelling X-Man character, and the new approach taken for the character who's turned into a bit of an anti-hero, maybe even reluctant hero, a concept that from the trailers I wasn't too sure about, mostly because it did feel like Magneto's past shouldn't really just be forgiven because Xavier left the X-Men to him in his will. Luckily, the episode does deal with this, first by showing Magneto saving some people and then saving some mutants from the Friends of Humanity, and then by Magneto being arrested and put on trial. So he is not just forgiven, in fact he is like immediately arrested pretty quickly, and then the episode focuses on his trial. Again, as I mentioned, it's crazy how quickly this show moves. There's absolutely zero filler as we go from big moment to big moment, and even in the smaller moments, like right before he's arrested, there are slower moments, but they're all very significant, such as the scene between Jean and Storm solidifying their friendship, or the sisterhood as they call it, and the scene between Magneto and Rogue revealing their shared past and impending romance. Having seen episodes 3 and 5, these moments remain very important going forward. As the trial of Magneto begins, we are introduced to the Executioner, who ends up being a very hateable, very memorable, and honestly kind of badass villain, whose whole action sequence alongside the protesters coinciding with Jean Grey giving birth, or rather Madeline Pryor giving birth, made for a very intense few minutes that all come to a head with Storm getting shot by a beam that permanently takes away her powers. Powers that, by the way, looked absolutely fantastic in this and the last episode. The moment was a bit of a shock. Again, we're only in episode 2, and now one of the X-Men has already gone through a life-changing event. It's followed up on later in the episode with Storm leaving the X-Men, again, only in episode 2, giving a speech through a letter to Jean that is really well written and voice acted, and the standout moment from that is when Storm is frightened by the lightning, a force she just lost control of, one that she seemingly never had to worry about her entire life. All of a sudden her connection to that is broken, and now it frightens her. I thought that was a really powerful moment. Then Storm losing her powers leads right into Magneto's speech, accompanied by this epic music. Is expertly written. I mean, I got chills when he said never again. All of this makes for easily the best few minutes of the 2-episode premiere. So intense, so impactful, so well written, such a great display of how great of a character Magneto is and can be. Although unlike Cyclops, that's not something the movies failed at. Already, this scene blew me away, and while the series took a few more episodes to reach this peak, it actually surpassed it just a few weeks later. Finally, the episode ends with another fantastic cliffhanger, revealing a second Jean Grey, one that in contrast to the Jean we've been seeing, says she needs the X-Men rather than wanting to leave it. This episode was absolutely fantastic, and the second best episode of the series of the first 5. So let's get into episode 3. Episode 3, titled Fire Made Flesh, is a grand showcase of the visuals of this show, as it does a lot of weird, trippy, reality-bending sequences, and while, yet again, a season's worth of story happens all in like one episode. Right off the bat, not beating around the bush at all, leaving all of the mystery to the week break between episodes, Beast quickly discovers and reveals that Jean, the one we've been seeing up until this point, is the clone. Something they probably did because this is a comic story, so people probably could have figured it out, and they did. But also because this show clearly does not like wasting any time. Beast revealing this, I will say, was a bit tone deaf. Beast in general does feel like a little bit less of a real person, and a bit more like a 90s cartoon character than everyone else, and not because of the way he looks. In fact, it was a bit jarring how Beast revealed it so nonchalantly, but then you have Jean's reaction to to Beast revelation feeling so much more real in comparison. I'll admit, I'm not too familiar with the Madeline Pryor story in the comics. I do know that her turning into the Goblin Queen is a much more permanent thing, which is why watching this episode I was surprised with how it pretty much all wrapped up in the end, and how Madeline never actually turned evil, more like she was possessed by Mr. Sinister. Still, I thought it was pretty well handled, firstly for Madeline and Scott's conversation, as the implications of Nate being the clone's baby is brought up, which is interesting. Then with the introduction of Mr. Sinister, another one of the big X-Men things that the movies completely ignored. Mr. Sinister's voice is super creepy, his design is fantastic, and his impact in just one episode is huge. With the introduction of Mr. Sinister, Madeline becomes the Goblin Queen, and things start going crazy, as each member of the X-Men goes through these crazy hallucinations that push the visuals of this show to another level, using each member's insecurities and fears against them. This isn't really like a new concept. This type of thing happens in like every single superhero show at least once, and it's the type of thing I'll absolutely never get tired of, especially when it looks this unique and this good, and when it doesn't go on for too long. In fact, I'll say it actually could have gone on for a bit longer in this episode, if I'm being honest. The fights in this episode are really great, especially the fight between Magneto and the Goblin Queen, which was very well animated. I don't like what they set up with Jean and Logan here, but the telepathic confrontation between Jean and Madeline was both super visually pleasing, intense, and even a bit thought-provoking, as the Jeans didn't know which memories belonged to which one, only for Madeline to be tied back to reality by a memory she knows for a fact is hers, the birth of her son. This makes the ending of the episode all that more tragic, as Mr. Sinister slips into the shadows, having already infected Nathan with the techno-organic virus that will turn him later into Cable. This is again another moment where it really felt like the series wastes no time. Nathan was literally just born in the previous episode and is already sent to the future. Pretty tragic. You definitely feel really bad for Scott and Madeline. They got like no time with their baby at all, and he leaves with Bishop into the future, who had a few cool moments in these episodes, especially this episode with the moment of Cyclops blasting him and him using that energy to blast the hallucinations. But while he had a few cool moments of using his powers, I don't think he really ever got the opportunity to shine as a character, like just with his depth or his character development. We'll see if he ever comes back. This episode also ends on a cliffhanger, although a less cool one of Storm meeting Forge setting up episode 4. I didn't like this episode as much as episodes 1 or especially 2, but it is still definitely really good. Episode 4 is a very weird one, titled Motendo / Lifedeath Part 1, and it's the only episode so far that I wouldn't say is great, both because it's split into 2, but also not down the middle. The first story is 17 minutes, the second is only 8, and because neither story really reaches the heights of the rest of the series. The first story, Motendo, feels like the type of story that would be told in a more episodic TV show that doesn't really concern itself much with an overarching plot. It doesn't really contribute much to the overarching plot, while putting certain characters into a fun, very different world. In this case, the Mojoverse, as Jubilee and Sunspot are placed into a video game, which, like the hallucination sequence in the last episode, is a bit of a trope in superhero cartoons. And while it's a fun one, it's rarely as effective as the hallucinations. Here, I wouldn't say it ever really surpassed as fun for me. At times, it's a bit confusing because the whole thing is about how Mojo is changing it up by using video games instead of shows. Except the whole point of video games is for the player to control the characters. This just seems like Jubilee and Sunspot are in a show that kind of looks like a video game. Anyway, this segment has some really nice visuals, some cute moments, and I like the ending. But overall, certainly the weakest part of the series so far, as while it's fun and has a good villain and has some cute moments, it doesn't really contribute much if anything. The second segment, Lifedeath Part 1, is so weirdly placed in the season. The second segment, which is only 8 minutes, is the Part 1 to the story, while Part 2 is not the next episode, it's episode 6. Why not just put these 8 minutes into episode 6 and have that be one episode? The only reason I could think that they didn't do that is because the Mojo story, which was only 17 minutes long, wasn't long enough to be its own episode, and maybe episode 6 was a long story, I'm not sure, but this is really weird. I do really like Storm's story of struggling, having lost her powers, and connection to the weather. Still, this segment is mostly just Storm and Forge hanging out, not really much happens. Like, this episode does do a good job of introducing Forge and fleshing him out, while also fleshing out Storm, and revealing that Forge invented the mutant inhibitor collars, and Forge falling in love with Storm. All of that is all well and good, but none of it, I think, justifies this placement in the season. It's so weird. This episode definitely felt like the series slowing to a halt after the first great 3 episodes. Still though, it's definitely not bad, and then episode 5 brought everything right back. Episode 5, titled Remember It, is the episode that finally made me decide to make a video about the show. I just really wanted to talk about it. This episode, or at least the last 15 or so minutes, were some of the most shocking I've seen in a while. Before those last 15 minutes, obviously the rest of the episode happens, and it starts relatively slow, starting with a documentary about the X-Men that later gives on some really great Cyclops moments where he pours out his frustrations to the interviewer, showing a bit of the emotional aftermath of losing his son, which is also brought up again in this great scene where Scott talks about Nate to who we later learned was actually Madeline Pryor. There's also some continuation of the clone issue and Scott's relationship with both of them, one the original, the other the mother of his child, and Scott and Jean's argument about this I think is very well written and thought-provoking. Like I said earlier, like, what do you do in this situation? I don't know. Unfortunately, Jean kissing Logan felt very weird. It's the one scene in this episode where I'm a bit shaky on. Again, I'd really love for them to let Wolverine move on from Jean to something more interesting than her. It's maybe the only thing that'd make me consider this episode to not be perfect. Although Wolverine, like, kind of not being okay with it is a bit interesting, I guess. Like, just let him move on, let him do something else, please. The reason for the documentary is the admission of the mutant nation of Genosha into the UN, which then becomes the primary setting for the episode, showcased through some really unique scenery and civilians, as well as some fantastically original music that does sound like it'd be native to a foreign country. This was just a really fun setting for this episode, although it definitely did not remain fun the entire time. One of those aforementioned civilians is Nightcrawler, who is, I'd say, sorely missing from the X-Men roster. I mean, his design is perfect, the visuals of his teleporting are really great, his character is full of energy and likability. I just love for him to become an X-Man and become a main character in this series. Some other civilians introduced here are Dazzler, Banshee, Moira McTaggart, although I don't think she's actually a civilian, she's on this panel, Emma Frost, and Sebastian Shaw, although none of them do anything too significant themselves, aside from asking Magneto to become the king of Genosha, which is not how I expected this to go down, especially since Magneto is like just setting in as leader of the X-Men. This leads to more relationship drama, paralleling like Scott, Jean, Madeline, and I guess Wolverine, as Magneto asks Rogue to rule Genosha alongside him as the queen. Better than this though was Rogue and Gambit's scene, which I think more than anything, and this is true for the entire episode, made Gambit feel way more three-dimensional and real, which definitely ends up being very important, because I'll be honest, during the first 4 episodes, Gambit, while badass and having some cool moments, felt like a bit more of a one-note character than a few others, whose shtick is throwing French words in there from time to time, and for some reason talking in the third person, which I still don't really get. This episode showed like his heart and his soul and what he truly brings to the table, just in time for him, however, to die. We'll get back to that. Before that, the Watcher is seen in the sky, which is likely nothing more than an Easter egg, but it's definitely a pretty cool one. Kind of like a reference to the only other, so far, Marvel Studios animated series. Or maybe it will come back into play in What If Season 3, I guess we'll find out. The following dance sequence has like the perfect mix of nice visuals and the perfect song that makes for such a pleasant vibe that, as we soon learn, is a bit of a calm before the storm. Cable comes out of nowhere, Madeline learns he's her son, and boom, everything goes to shit. This was a super intense few minutes that leads into an absolutely terrific 10 minutes of television in which the intensity absolutely never for a second dies down. Cable showing up implying something time travel related is happening, but we're probably seeing it happen from the other perspective, so we have absolutely no idea what's going on, as we're just thrown into the chaos and seemingly out of nowhere placed into one of these alternate timelines where everything goes wrong and nothing and no one is off limits. Off the bat, Banshee is killed, Nightcrawler is brutally injured, many Genoshan are killed, and Genosha is left in ruin by a mysterious giant unstoppable sentinel that also employs a bunch of other sentinels. Rogue, Gambit, and Magneto's fights against sentinels are fantastically animated and visually spectacular. Magneto shines here as he has this really interesting moment of these events recalling him back to the Holocaust, another one of those things that shows how compelling of a character Magneto is. I love the moment of the Marlock saying the X-Men won't save them, a sentinel shows up and you think they might die, but then it turns out Gambit is on it, the X-Men music plays, and he destroys the sentinel. That was just a top tier X-Men moment, and it only gets better from there. Right after that comes what seems to be Magneto's death, accompanied by beautiful visuals. Magneto telling Leech not to be scared in German before being seemingly eradicated was so powerful, and the hits don't stop coming. The visuals and the animation never stop being spectacular, like for a second. The pumping heartbeat music is intense as Rogue is flying towards the big Sentinel, and Gambit is absolutely badass right up until the moment he's stabbed. This is the moment where it felt like, yeah, okay, this is genuinely lost. They lost. Everyone's going to die. They're going to be reversing this timeline, but then maybe not, as Gambit smiles and glows, and it's revealed he must have gotten stabbed on purpose so that he could use the metal to blow the big Sentinel up, with the last words being the name is Gambit, followed by the title of the episode, Remember It? The entire time this was happening, my jaw was on the floor, absolutely gobsmacked, flabbergasted even, by the excellence on screen. It was just so exciting, so intense, so engaging. I don't know if I've ever been this thoroughly impressed and engaged by a piece of X-Men media, save for maybe Logan and X-Men Days of Future Past. This is just pure and absolute cinema, and that really goes for the entire last 15 or so minutes of the episode. Absolutely incredible stuff. Like, honestly, hats off to you. This was absolutely fantastic. And then the episode ends with Rogue crying over Gambit's dead body, saying, "I can't feel you." I mean, what a powerful image, what a powerful moment. It seems like these events will be erased, probably, but on the off chance they aren't. This was genuinely one of the best deaths in media I've seen in a while, one that feels very final. Magneto's death, on the other hand, which, while great, doesn't feel quite as final. I wouldn't be surprised if none of this is erased, and it's revealed that Magneto actually survived, while maybe Leech and a few other mutants that were with him didn't. I absolutely loved this episode, certainly the best episode of this series so far, and a perfect 10 out of 10. Maybe there was like one moment I didn't love, but that isn't enough for me to bring it down to a 9. So then, the average rating of the first 5 episodes is an 8.2. Brought down a good amount by episode 4, but I do think it should become less and less significant as the season goes on, and I can't imagine any of the 5 remaining episodes, including a 3-part finale, that will be lower than an 8 out of 10. I could imagine all of them being 10 out of 10s. This show is really great. Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below, and thanks for watching.